everyone. How are we doing this evening? Good? Coming off a weekend of lots of celebration and events and all the things. We enjoyed this past weekend with you all for our 40th anniversary, but we're excited to kick off this new ministry year with our Fall Faith Formation series that we are beginning tonight, and we're glad that you've joined us. Our faith formation model last year for our sexuality, gender, and faith series went so well that we thought, you know what? Why not do it again? Why not keep it going? And we've got such great feedback. So here we are following the same pattern we did last year of second Wednesday forums and in here at the church, and fourth week small groups and host homes with a couple locations here at the church as well. Though I will give a disclaimer, some of our groups are actually meeting the third week and not the fourth week, but you get it. Twice a month gatherings, what we'll be doing this fall. We encourage you to be a part of a small group for this series. So if you have signed up for a small group, you should have heard from one of your small group leaders this past week. Or if you haven't heard, you will probably hear by the end of the week what group you're in, since we put together everyone based on their availability. If you don't know what group you're in, I do have a list that you can look at the end of this so that you know which night you are attending this month. We have 6 groups meeting this year, 2 here at the church and 4 in host homes. And so if you didn't sign up, but would like after this decide, you know what, I really want to be a part of a group, we'd love for you to do that. You can see me after this and we'll make sure you get plugged into one. For the next 3 months, so September, October, November, we will be focusing on the series we're beginning tonight, From Veggie Tales to the Real World, where we will explore Bible stories that we read and learned as children and help us make sense of them for our adult lives now. In the spring, we will continue the same model, February, March, and April, though every month may have a different topic. It may not necessarily be a 3-month series. But we hope you keep engaging with these discussions and learning with us this year. Now I want to introduce to you our teacher for this evening. Though many of you know her, she was here just a few months ago, I think in February, to lead one of our education forums. But Dr. Jennifer Garcia Bashaw is an associate professor of New Testament and Christian ministry at Campbell University. She has a passion for teaching the Bible on a lay level and contributes social media content to outlets such as Baptist News Global and the Bible for Normal People, where she is a nerd in resident, as they call themselves. Dr. Bashaw is an ordained American Baptist minister who enjoys preaching as well as training and resourcing pastors. She's the author of Scapegoats, The Gospel Through the Eyes of Victims, and John for Normal People, a guide through the drama and depth of the fourth gospel. So we're excited to have Dr. Bashaw back with us this evening. And she will be here teaching us not only tonight, but for the next 2 months as well for this series. And tonight, like I've said, we're focusing on different Bible stories. And tonight's story is Joshua and the Battle of Jericho is kind of our focus. If featured in the Veggie Tales story, which you see behind me as Josh and the Big Wall. So hopefully you had a chance to watch that video ahead of time. But if not, it's okay. I'm sure you've heard the story, and we'll recap it a little bit tonight. And it will still be a time that is meaningful and challenging as we look at the story in fresh lenses. Now, if you joined us last year for our forum, you know we intentionally did not leave a whole lot of time for Q&A or discussion or anything. However, we imagine this year's forums and small groups will be a little less formal and will allow for time for questions and commentary throughout. So Dr. Bashaw may have time for questions at the end or throughout. So there will be more time than there was last year, and we hope that that is helpful. The forum is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel tomorrow once our e-news goes out. And so if you want to recap before your small group, or if you know somebody in your small group isn't here tonight and you want to send them that link, that will be going out tomorrow. Any questions about this year of our faith formation? We're glad you are all here with us. So as we begin this time together, let us take a moment to pray together as we get started. Holy God, we thank you for a space to gather, to fellowship, to learn and to grow and to challenge ourselves. We thank you for another year of ministry together, another year of spiritual formation, asking questions, diving deeper into the things that we've known our whole lives, or maybe new things we're learning now, but with a new perspective and a chance to reflect on those things together and grow closer to you. May you be with us as we begin this journey for this year. May you be with our small group leaders and our forum leaders and every person in this room and who's taking part in it as we open up our hearts and our minds to what you might have to speak to us this year. We love you. In your name we pray. Amen. So Dr. Bashaw.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm very excited to be here. I love coming back here. Every time I come back here, for whatever reason it is, it's been a while since I've preached here, but I've preached here like 5-6 years ago, maybe. Taught here, get to come here when my former students are ordained. All this stuff is exciting. So I'm happy to be here today. What I thought I would do with this series is, yes, we are going to look at the story that has been portrayed in the Veggie Tales movie, Joshua and Jericho. But the way that I want to go about doing it is we're going to go through it, and I want to highlight some ways that we can interpret the Bible more responsibly. One of my favorite things to teach is what we call hermeneutics, or biblical interpretation, like how to interpret texts. And I think that in general, we don't have a lot of time to do that in churches, to learn hermeneutics or biblical interpretation. And so the way I'm going to do it is we're going to sort of go through and ask some of the questions that I think are important to ask of texts. And I think what will happen is that we'll see that most of the time these Veggie Tales movies get some of the main points, and they're definitely helpful for kids, right? But there's so much more going on in these stories, and we miss it if we don't kind of slow down and take some steps to really look at what's happening in the biblical literature. So with Josh and the Big Wall, I will say that this is probably one of the better Veggie Tales ones for just the way they go about telling the story, because they do sort of introduce the bigger story of Israel and what's happening. They do some historical context, as we say that. So that's really great. And they do hit some important points in the story. I'm thinking of how they talk about how the angel comes to talk to Joshua, and it's not necessarily about whose side the angel is on, but it's more about if they're listening or on God's side. That's a really good point from that story, so I think they picked that up really well. But there are a lot of questions that arise when you start talking about war and conquest and other things that are going on in the story. There are pieces of the story as well that don't get addressed when we're talking to children. We're going to talk about Rahab and other pieces of the story that don't come in, which makes sense. But the first thing I want to do, and I probably need to figure out how to work this thing. Okay. The first thing I want to do is tell you what I think is good for us to do every time we come to a passage. And that is, there's actually pre-work that should happen. That before we even start talking about reading the passage and start asking about literary context and things like that, we need to do some pre-work. And that pre-work involves you as an interpreter. We bring things to the stories in the Bible when we read them, things that we already have in our brain. There are, the things you learned growing up in church, like Veggie Tales, sermons you've heard. There are biases that we have. There are, social and political commitments that we have. There's so much that make up so many things that make up who we are as people, and that is also who we are as interpreters. So as our preliminary work for this story, and I'm not going to read through it because I'm going to assume that you know the story. I'm going to read a little bit of some other stories in a second, and that you watch the video. But I want you to think about what are some things that you sort of already know or think about this story. Maybe it's just things you learned in Sunday school or things you learned in the video or whatever. So I want you to sort of think about those things, have those in your brain. The next step is a little bit harder to ask what kind of preconceptions that you have about this. How do you feel when you read this story? Does it make you feel victorious? Does it make you feel nervous? Does it make you uncomfortable? Like those sort of things. Like kind of feel like what emotions you get when you think about this story, what ideas kind of come up because it's not necessarily that there would be wrong or bad things. Uh, but it's possible if you have some strong ideas about a particular text or a particular story, then they might serve as blinders for having other ideas come forth, other themes, other things you might notice. It might stop you from asking particular questions. And so whenever you encounter a text, I think it's really good to think about these things. Where am I coming from on this story? Are there commitments I have in my life that may bias me or skew me towards a particular interpretation? So kind of think about those things at this point. And then what do you think are the main ideas or themes of this story? Like I said, they do a good job of pointing some of them out, but maybe you have some other ones that you have in your brain. And so I think I would like for you to just talk to your neighbor really quickly about any of these things that come up when you were thinking. If there are some emotions that come up or what you might think are the main ideas. So I'm going to just give you a minute or two, so not too long, but just turn to one of your neighbors and address whichever one you want. You don't have to address all of these, but whatever you thought about. Hey, I'm going to call you back. I know it was not very much time, but at least you probably got to say a couple of things. Get yourself sort of ready. When I haven't given you questions, but I have questions in my brain that I want to give you. If you're in a small group, I'm going to have some more in-depth questions on this, kind of thinking about yourself as an interpreter. And so you can talk about that further in your groups when you guys meet. And so hopefully you got a little bit of like pre-work in. Let's go to the next slide. I think that if the figuring out who you are as an interpreter and how that affects the passage is your first step. The second step, and scholars disagree about what order these should come in. I like to ask literary questions first. So literary context is sort of the next thing that we need to talk about. And the very first literary question I always want to ask of a passage is, what is the genre of this passage? What kind of literature is it? Because our Bible is made up of so many different types of literature, and if you don't know what kind of literature you're reading, then you will read it incorrectly. Maybe not 100% of the time, but you will probably read it incorrectly. In the Old Testament, we have there's law, there's poetry, there's wisdom literature, there's apocalyptic literature, and the one that is the most frequent in the Old Testament is narrative, and this is ancient narrative. So there's stories being told, and in this context, we're talking about the story of God and Israel, and so we got to think along the lines of ancient narrative. Now, ancient narrative is not, I kept hearing what you were saying, it's not history in the sense of we think of history, right? We think of history that, if you're going to read a story about World War II, I mean, you're going to get dates, you're going to get numbers, you're going to get names, everything's going to be sort of about the details and how did this exactly happen? Like, what happened in these events? This is not the way ancient narrative was written. That was not the purpose of it. So when Israel was writing their story, and they're writing the story about the conquest, which was an important part of their history, they are not thinking, we need to report these events exactly as they happened. That's not what they're thinking. This is not the point of ancient narrative, especially ancient Israelite narrative. They are trying to tell their stories in such a way that helps them as they move forward in their relationship with Yahweh. So they're trying to tell the story in a way that highlights sort of good things and bad things that happened, but also to serve as warnings for the future, to talk about the character of God, to talk about humanity. They have lots of purposes, but the main purpose is not to report events in history. So that is one of the first things that we need to know before we go forward with this story. And something that the video did well was tell us, like, situate us where we are in this big overarching story of Israel's relationship with God. So it talked about, what happened in Exodus and Moses. And so it gave us quite a bit of context, getting us into the story of Joshua. And so I think that's good. We don't have to do too much on that. But anytime you are reading something from the Old Testament, this is another, question you need to ask after you ask what is genre. When we're in a particular passage, you kind of have to ask, like, what are the boundaries of this passage? And different people will have different answers to this, because you open up a study Bible and there's headings, and all the headings and the chapter breaks and things like that are put in by later translators and people who put together different translations of the Bible. So you can't necessarily assume that just because there's a heading that's where that story is. So you kind of have to read before and read after and kind of get situated in the story. Now, strictly speaking, I put the boundaries here of the story of Joshua and the army of the Israelites taking Jericho. So I put that, but with the understanding that it's in the middle of a bigger narrative of what's happening. And Joshua is told in a very interesting way. It doesn't feel very chronological. It's not supposed to be very chronological. So there are other pieces to the story that are in other chapters that aren't actually necessarily right before and right after. But you do have to do that. You do have to take your passage and then look at what comes before. It might just be the story before it. What comes after, it might just be the story after it, but it might not. You might have to go all the way back to the beginning of the book and kind of trace it and see what's happening. And that is actually what we have to do with this story, because in Joshua chapter 2, this is really when the story of Jericho, of the conquest of Jericho, starts. And so I'm actually going to read this. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then we're going to watch the Bible Project. I'm going to read the story, this piece of the story, and you can see why it wouldn't have been something that we put in a children's story. Yeah. Thank you. Then Joshua, son of Nun, sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies. This is a little throwback to something that happened before when the Israelites were wandering sort of in the wilderness towards the promised land. They sent 12 spies into the promised land, and the 12 spies came back, and 10 of them said, there's no way we're going to take this land, and 2 of them said, well, God said we could take this land, and that was Joshua and Caleb. And so this is just a throwback. Oh, look, now we're sending in 2 spies this time instead of 12. Go, view the land, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and spent the night there. There's no explanation of why they're entering the house of Rahab the prostitute, but okay. The king of Jericho was told, some Israelites have come here tonight to search out the land. Then the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come only to search out the whole land. But the woman took the 2 men and hid them. Then she said, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. And when it was time to close the gate at dark, the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you can overtake them. She had, however, brought them up to the roof and hidden them within the stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So the men pursued them on the way to the Jordan as far as the fords. As soon as the pursuers had gone, the gate was shut. Before they went to sleep, she came to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that dread of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. As soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no courage left in any of us because of you. The Lord your God is indeed God in heaven above and on earth below. Now then, since I have dealt kindly with you, swear to me by the Lord that you in turn will deal kindly with my family. Give me a sign of good faith that you will spare my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. The men said to her, our life for yours. If you do not tell this business of ours, then we will deal kindly and faithfully with you when the Lord gives us the land. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the outer side of the city wall, and she resided within the wall itself. She said that to them, "Go towards the hill country, so that the pursuers may not come upon you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until the pursuers have returned, then afterward you may go your way." The men said, "We will be released from this oath that you have made us swear to you if we invade the land and you do not tie this crimson cord in the window through which you let us down, and you do not gather into your house your father, your mother, your brothers, and all your family. If any of you go out of the doors of your house into the street, they shall be responsible for their own death, and we shall be innocent. But if a hand is laid upon any who are with you in the house, we shall bear responsibilities for this death." Okay, so this piece of the story here is actually the introduction to the story of Joshua and Jericho. But it actually doesn't come right before it. It comes in chapter 2. And there's a reason for it. I think there's a literary reason for it. And you kind of figure it out once you go to some stories that are after it. I'm not going to read the story of Achan and Ai, but I will say that after the Jericho story, there's a story where they do not have a victory, and that is at the city of Ai. And Achan is a man who went against the Lord's law to not keep certain items for the Lord. Items that of great worth that should be dedicated to the Lord. And he stole some of those items before the Battle of Ai. And so when they go into battle, it was a small little battle. They didn't send very many soldiers, but they were defeated. And so it tells us then the reason is because of this Israelite who didn't do what he was supposed to do. So we have story bookends here of Rahab, the prostitute, who is not an Israelite, and Achan, who is an Israelite. And you have a story of a city that was taken because the people obeyed and listened to God, and then a story of a city that they were not able to take because of disobedience. So there's a lot of parallels going on here between these two stories. You have to read them together. And so when we don't read the story of Rahab, I think we miss some of the main ideas here. Probably when you were thinking of the themes of this story, you're saying maybe listening to God, trusting God, obeying God results in success. Like this was the idea that the angel was going to bring, and then kind of the way the story goes says you experienced this great victory at Jericho because you listened and you trusted God. Yes, that is definitely one of the main stories here. Main ideas of the story. But when you start thinking about this Rahab character, and you start thinking about ancient literature and how women are not very much often mentioned, especially women who are prostitutes, and in Israelite story, someone who is not an Israelite who is mentioned, you have to ask questions. Why is this story being told? It seems like there's something important going on here. And there is. I think that the author is trying to actually present Rahab as a model Israelite. Now, our maybe ethics or our like modern morality might resist that a little bit, to say, well, she's a prostitute and she lied and she hid and she, sort of manipulated a situation to save her family. But those are our own ideas that we're bringing into the text. If you read most of the stories in the Old Testament that talk about sort of underdog characters, when they use cunning to save themselves, especially if they're in marginalized or oppressed situations, then this is actually a good thing. It happens over and over and over again in the text. And so Rahab is a hero in this story, but not just because she used her cunning to save her family, but because she says the thing that other Israelites are supposed to say. Your God is the God of heaven and earth. And she had faith that God was good, not her God, right? She's a Canaanite, that God, their God, Yahweh, had power to defeat her own people. Right, so it's really interesting that the author set her up as the model Israelite, just like setting up the model victory, Jericho, and then the Israelite man is the one who does the thing that is wrong and results in a defeat. So there's a lot going on here literarily, and if we don't look at what comes before and what comes after, then we're going to miss like some really key themes of this whole story. Now, I want to give you a cheat, I guess is the best way to say it. I want to give you a shortcut because it's kind of hard to, out of nowhere, unless you're an English teacher or something, to start noticing all these things in the text. But I think that there are some helps online that could help you. I use the Bible Project videos in my class because I think they do a really good job of setting up the literary map of the different books. So I'm gonna play this one. We're not gonna do the whole thing, but I want to show you how they go about telling this literary story. So if you do need a little help when you're reading different books in the Bible, you can go to them. And also, they're gonna do some things that I think are important for us to do later. Okay. And I wanted us to look at that is because not only does it talk about what we just talked about, but it also gives us a little bit of context for what we're about to talk about. So I highly recommend the Bible Project. I will say they do tend to give moderate evangelical explanations for things. I'm going to put them right there. So I don't agree with everything they say. You notice they kind of skirted over Rahab pretty quickly. They mentioned her good, but they don't talk about how important she is really in the story. And the other reason we know that Rahab's important is because she's mentioned later in the Old Testament and also in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew. So you got to have those sort of clues too. But so moving to historical cultural context, and I'm going to refer back to the Bible Project in a little bit. There are lots of things to consider with whatever story that you're in, but the cultural differences between their time period and their religion and our time period, we have to talk about these. I think a lot of times people will read what's going on and just kind of like zap forward to the future and see that it must apply today in our context, but there's a lot of things going on. So you have to ask things. How was their religion different at this time period? Of course, there are many people around them that are worshiping other gods, but also most scholars are going to say that at this point in Israel's history, they were actually what we call henotheists, not monotheists, which means they did actually believe in other gods. They believed there were other gods, but they believed that Yahweh was the main God, was their God, right? And so this is why they keep getting into trouble for idolatry, because they did believe there were other gods. And so very different religious views really than we have today. So you have to make note of those. Of course, their political context is different than ours, their economic context, the way that they gather together in family and tribes, other social systems that are going on here. One example of like a social system would be Rahab. We tend to maybe judge her because she is a prostitute, but there were not a lot of options for women to take care of their families, right? Women didn't usually have jobs. And so if she were the head of a family because she didn't have a husband or whatever, she would have to do whatever she needed to do. And it was an honorable thing for her to provide for her family. And so the negative sort of connotations that we have don't really apply in their situation. So all of these things are things that we have to consider when we're reading different stories here. Okay, we're gonna go to the next slide. And I don't know why it happens. I just press it once. Okay, there we go. So theological issues. These are questions that we ask of the text, and I think the Bible Project did a really good job of saying what are some of the questions that arise from this text. So two things I want to talk about with this Jericho story. One is historicity. Because we are dealing with ancient narrative. Now, the Bible Project didn't talk about this because, again, I said they're kind of evangelical. They don't want to probably address this. But we're dealing with ancient narrative. But we have learned growing up, I did anyway in church, that this is history. Like the things that are in these stories happened, right? But we have to recognize that there is not a lot of archaeological evidence that the conquest happened in the way that it said they did in Joshua. That anything like what happened with Jericho and the walls, that there's not archaeological evidence of it. You might have seen some stories online that will say like they found the walls of Jericho and they were like out instead of in, which is like opposite of what normally happens. That's fake news. It is. It's not. That's not true. And archaeologists will also say, and historians will say, there's not a lot of proof that the conquest happened in this way. It looks like they kind of moved in. They may have had some battles with people, Israel and the Canaanites, but they kind of moved in alongside them and like infiltrated probably slowly. And so we have to ask this question: like, what does this do if these events that are portrayed in Joshua didn't happen exactly that way? What does that mean for us? And so there are different ways to deal with it, right? Sometimes what people will do is they will prioritize their own view of Scripture over the idea of history, or of there it not being history, I guess. So if you have a view of Scripture that says everything that happens in Scripture is something that was an event in real history, then you'll probably prioritize that, and you'll say, this is the way this battle happened. And I think lots of Christians do that. I think most Christians probably do it that way. But, I mean, there is another way to do that, and that is to realize the nature of Scripture, that what we are reading is an account between of Israel's relationship with God, and they're trying to interpret like what their relationship with God is like, and they're moving forward and trying to figure out how do we be faithful people. That we have genre that is different than modern history. So if you can get your mind around those, then you're not asking questions like, is this the way this happened? Or you're not thinking like, oh, this is written to tell us history. If you can move past that, there's so many more theological ideas. There's so many more applications that you can come to, like the idea of Rahab. If we believe that one of the main ideas of this story is that an outsider is someone who can actually be a faithful person, maybe someone who would be a model of faith, then the way that we live in the world and look at people who we consider outsiders might change. But that's a point that we wouldn't actually ask if we're only concerned with historical matters, right? When we can push past historicity ideas, we will start picking up more like literary themes, the things that Israel was trying to communicate to themselves. They were trying to say in the future, maybe we shouldn't just all like circle the wagons and be about Israelites. Maybe people from the outside can teach us something. Maybe people from the outside can be faithful followers of God, right? And so you see how those layers will miss if we're like staying on the surface level of historicity. Another huge problem is the one they brought up in the Bible Project video. Like, how do we deal with this violence that seems to come from God, right? And they gave a good literary explanation of it, that it's hyperbole. The idea that God says everybody needs to die is hyperbole. It's exaggerating. It's not the way that it actually happened. They say the Canaanites were, evil, and they were sacrificing children, and so God wanted to keep the Israelites away from those practices, and that's true. That's actually part of the narrative, but there are other ways to explain this as well. Some people will just say, well, God's ways are higher than our ways, right? And so if God is violent, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to be violent. Okay, I mean, that's one way to explain it as well. There is a guy named Rene Girard who has this very interesting solution. I'm bringing him in not just because he's one of the people I write about, but I think he has a very interesting explanation of violence in the Bible. His idea is that we actually, as humans, project our own violence onto God. And it happens in the Hebrew scriptures that the idea of sacrificing, the idea of going out and killing, when it seems to come from God, it's actually the human interpretation of what has happened. It's our own human violence that we're projecting onto God and then saying that it originated from God, right? So there's a lot more to his theory, but I think it's good for us to consider options. When we come to these hard questions in a text, one, we shouldn't ignore them. But two, like, we need to have dialogue about it. Like, how do we explain this? When we get to the New Testament and we see the character of God in Jesus, and it does not seem to be the kind of character of a God that would kill a whole people group, right? Or that would ask people to sacrifice, to have violence at the core of their religion. And so when we look at it that way, then we have to take a step back and say, okay, let's ask some hard questions about what's happening here in the Bible and the text. And I don't think that it means that we have any less respect for the biblical text or anything like that. I think it means that we want to learn, and we respect the text enough to let it speak in its own context, in what it is. So those are the theological issues. The last steps of interpretation, I would say. Now we can get to more of an application. Now, is every single story in the Bible directly applicable to us today? I would say no. I would say no because of all the historical context. But I think we can find things that are helpful. And so the kind of questions that we might ask. How am I doing on time? Okay. What main ideas? We've done this already, but what main ideas might this passage be communicating to its ancient audience? Now, that's the first question we have to ask. Instead of jumping right straight to what is this passage saying to me, we have to ask, what is the author of this passage trying to communicate to his or her ancient audience? So that's a good first question. The two questions we talk about in my class a lot: what might this passage teach us about God? And notice that I'm using the word might and not does. Not what does this passage teach us about God, because we need each other, we need community in order to interpret Scripture. So, like, putting things out there, like, what are some possible things that this teaches us about God, gets us to dialogue and hear other people's their opinions, their experiences, maybe their insights into Scripture as well. So, what might this passage teach us about God, and what might this passage teach us about humanity? Right now, on the surface, if you might say this passage teaches us that God will command humans to commit violence in order to keep them faithful to to their God, and that you could say that, right? Because it does kind of seem like that's what's going on. But we are not then looking at the bigger theological issues. We are not then looking at the bigger story of Israel. We are not then looking at the bigger story of Jesus and the character of God that we see in Jesus, right? So you could answer it that way. This is why we need each other, because we need to hear each other's answers, right? What might this passage teach us about humanity? I kind of already gave you one idea. It might teach us that outsiders have something to teach us about God. That maybe the people that we think are not holy or not moral or whatever it might be are the ones that are actually faithful, and we should listen to what they can teach us. And then you can get to a question like, what ideas from this passage could still be applicable in our context today? And the reason that I put these sort of questions in that order is because I want to make sure that we don't always just jump to, what does this passage mean for me, right? Because it may not be applicable 100% to us, right? We are not trying to, take over the promised land or anything like that. We're not telling our story in a way to, make sure that we're faithful to God in the future. So we have big differences between us and the original audience. So I did want to leave some time for questions, and I did leave 10 minutes. So good. So I'm going to open it up to any questions that you have. I mean, I threw a lot of stuff at you, and I will follow up a little bit on these with the questions that I'm going to give you for your small groups, because we're going to talk about it. But I would love to hear your questions or concerns. Concerns are okay, because I brought up a lot of stuff that maybe you haven't heard before. Yeah.
I did read somewhere years ago that there had been no archaeological evidence of a wall. Mm-hmm. Then I did some reading last week after watching this Veggie Tales, and they have found walls, but they can't put them in the time frame.
Right. Yes, yes, we have found walls all throughout Canaan, actually, what would have been Canaan, in different places. Yes, but when we try to match things up, not just the walls, but like the things that say that different people groups came into that land, it doesn't seem to match the timeline that we have. And I think that's because we modern people have kind of tried to put a timeline on things when we're reading a text that is not concerned with the timeline, right? They're much more concerned with what can we learn from our past, or how can we tell this story in a way that will help us moving forward, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Other questions? Not just about the story. You could talk just about in general biblical interpretation. You have another one.
Can you say what you said before about monotheism
And henotheism?
Because I have a follow-up question to that.
Yeah, so from the time, definitely from Abraham. Abraham was a polytheist when he was called. I mean, he was, in Babylon, and he was worshiping other gods. From that time, probably all the way to the exile, scholars believe that the Israelites did have the idea that there were multiple gods, right? In Egypt, they were worshiping other gods, and even talks about at the end of Joshua's like, let's not go ahead and worship all the gods that we used to worship in Egypt. Moving forward, we should not worship those other gods. But the fact that he has to say it means that they were worshiping the other gods, right?
Well, and that kind of explains the commandment that says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." It doesn't say there are no other gods.
Right. That's right.
Just you shall not worship their no.
Right. So we need to assume that they believe that there is a pantheon of gods, but that their God is the God in heaven, God on earth, the one that Rahab talks about, the head honcho God, the most powerful God. Yes, the Almighty God. So that does kind of change when you're reading the Old Testament. It kind of changes the way you look at the stories. And then once we get to exile, they believe the way they interpreted their history was that they were defeated by the Babylonians and taken to exile because they were worshiping other gods. And so when they told the story that way, they said, well, we need to make sure that we don't worship other gods anymore. So when they came back from exile, they got really strict about worshiping only one God. And then it becomes really monotheistic after that. Yeah, good question. Did you have a question too?
Are those videos from the Bible Project available to the general public?
Yes, all of them are. You can just go to YouTube and put in Bible Project, and then put whatever book you want to look at, and they have these literary synopsises, is basically of each of the books in the Bible. They also have other ones, like really good ones, like what is the Bible? What are literary genres in the Bible? What is holiness? Like they have thematic, topical ones. Then they're so good. They really are. So when you find yourself asking questions and you're like, I don't really know where to start, I think that's a good place to start for those. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think there may be like a video on the Second Temple literature or something like that, but they're not going to go through each of them. Because like I said, they're made by an Old Testament scholar and a pastor, and they have good scholarship behind them, but they do come from an evangelical context. So there's some places they won't go, right? There's some places they won't go. They'll hint at it sometimes, but there are some places they won't go. They're not going to say in this video, well, it's probably the humans, idea of God that God wanted them to defeat these people. Like, it's actually human violence, not God's violence. Like, they wouldn't say that here because that's like a little too radical for them. But it is a possibility, right? Yeah. Other questions? Oh, I didn't even have to leave 10 minutes for questions then. Let me see if there's anything else I can tell you. No, I'm just kidding. I'll let you out early. But I will get those questions to you all for your groups. And I'm going to focus a little bit this time. Yes, we'll talk about the story, but I want to focus on getting you through sort of some steps of how you might approach a passage with the pre-work and the literary context and the historical context and all of that. I'll give you a little bit more about that for your questions. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bashaw, for the first of 3 sessions with us. I hope that you were challenged by some of the questions that she asked, and maybe you had time to think about start thinking about your pre-work of what do you bring to this text. Like she said, we'll be doing more of that in the discussion guides that your small group leaders are going to get from us this week in preparation for our small groups. I think a couple of them are meeting next week, and then most of them will meet the 4th week. But we have 2 more sessions to go. The next one in October will be October 9th, I believe. It's the second Wednesday in here, same drill. And the next story will be about King David, which is and Bathsheba. It's the Veggie Tales story of King Georgie and the Ducky. So that's an interesting take on that story. Yeah, but the biblical text is, very interesting. I don't think when I was a kid I put those 2 stories together at all when I watched Veggie Tales, but it's funny to watch it back as an adult. So, but we hope you'll join us in October. If you have questions about which small group you're in, there's a roster over there. I'll get somebody from the Adult Faith Formation Council to be over there. I will be over here with Greystone merch if you want to come grab your stuff. And like we said, the recordings and you have the handout, but I will post the slides and a link to the video, the Bible Project video. They also have a website where like all of it's categorized and listed. That's how I access them. We watch a lot of them with the youth, but where you can do a little more searching more easily on their website than I think YouTube. But they're all there. They're very helpful and good overviews to use. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope you have a good rest of your evening.